Behold my fury!
Baldur's Gate 3 released about a week ago, and I gotta say that this might just be my game of the year. I really enjoyed the new Star Wars game, despite its issues at launch, and I have faith that Starfield will be good as well, but I just can't see anything topping BG3 this year. I had to force myself away from my keyboard to make this video because I didn't want to stop playing. This game is an absolute masterclass of what an RPG should be, and I hope to see more developers trying to reach this level of quality. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the gaming genre, it's a CRPG or a classic role-playing game similar to Pillars of Eternity, Pathfinder, and of course, Divinity Original Sin, which is made by the same developers. These are just a few of the CRPGs that I've played, but they imitate the traditional Dungeons & Dragons feel of that tabletop adventure. This game is developed by Larian Studios, which are the guys behind Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2. This game is mostly single-player, but has a drop-in, drop-out multiplayer system that lets you group with your friends. There is no cash shop or microtransactions. What you see is what you get. As is the case, this is a turn-based game where you have the option of recruiting characters to join your party, so you aren't just managing your own character, but 3 others as well. You can have more than 3 companions, but only up to 4 active in your party at one time, and the rest hang out in your camp. Now, just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm not someone who has spent a lot of time playing Dungeons & Dragons, and I knew next to nothing about the Baldur's Gate universe and D&D lore coming into this game. I'm currently at the start of Act 3, and I've got about 70 hours logged on Steam, and from my understanding, Baldur's Gate 3 is essentially just Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the game, and the developers at Larian did not hold back on making it feel authentic. BG3 lets you think inside the box, outside the box, and hell, they'll probably even let you stash the box in your inventory and use it as an improvised weapon later on. This game reminds me a lot of Elden Ring in that it doesn't hold your hand and that you're constantly rewarded for exploring and going off of the beaten path. Jumping right in, I want to talk about the combat because I feel like the turn-based nature of the game might just be the most jarring part for someone who isn't familiar with the genre. My first few hours on the game were just me taking it all in and trying to get used to the combat, like the action system, which determines how many things you can do in one turn of a fight. As I played more though, it grew on me and I've come to really enjoy the fights as it feels like you're playing chess in a way, strategically setting up everything to beat the encounters. The game really makes you think several turns ahead, and it usually leaves me thinking, do I prioritize getting off another hit? Should I cast an aura? Or should I better position my companions for the future turns? This level of give and take is really made possible because of the action system, which determines, again, how many actions your specific character has per turn. Starting off, it'll probably be something like 1 main action and 1 bonus action, so maybe you could leap at an enemy and then take a swing. As you progress, though, and your characters become stronger, you'll notice that you can take more actions with passives, but your enemies can too. I mean, I've been in fights where the NPC will come at me, take 4 swings, and just kill me off on the first turn, and then I'm sitting here like, I guess it's time to reload. Despite this, the game doesn't really feel unfair, and it does feel good to finish fights with your party of 4 against, say, 15 enemies or something crazy like that. Now, you probably think that with the amount of enemies that you're fighting in this game, they'd start to get kind of stale, right? Well, I can say that while the enemy types are reused depending on the overall zone, I noticed that enemies never felt repetitive as the subzones and encounters were different enough that it consistently felt like I was fighting something new pretty often. At the point where I'm at with my characters, I feel like my gear is good enough to where I'm not really wearing some of the new stuff that I get, as it isn't always tempting, but every so often I do find something with a cool spell or an effect that makes me consider using it. Also, every item has a 3D model that you can examine, and the loot is visually distinct, especially when you get into the higher rarities. You can also dye your armor and weapons if that's something you're interested in, which I definitely am, because I'm a cosmetic Andy. My favorite part of the combat mechanics, though, is that for the most part, if you can think it, you can do it, much like traditional D&D. There are so many ways to approach situations that it's baffling. For example, there was a fight in particular in Act 1 where I was overwhelmed and kept getting smacked around, but after a couple deaths I went, what if I start throwing and kicking these goblins? And so I started just chucking them off the ledge into a pit of spiders, and I managed to single out the boss and complete the encounter. I know to some of you this might sound like a really simple thing, but early on I wasn't really utilizing my D&D brain. I really started to notice the scope of this game when I realized that you could pick up a chest and hold it in your inventory if you didn't have enough lockpicks, or you just didn't feel like opening it right away. This level of freedom doesn't just apply to the general world though, it's also ingrained into the combat, and it's amazing. You can even set up party positions while one of your characters is engaged in dialogue just to help with that little boost for when the fight starts. And then after all of that battling, your characters might get tired and mention that they need to take some sort of rest. Rests are the main method in which you replenish your character's abilities and spells by taking short and long rest, as well as heal the party if necessary. Now this might sound like a lot, but trust me, it's much easier than it sounds. All of these systems work in tandem to make you feel like you're part of the world with your companions, and it really puts the RP in RPG. So now that we've talked about the different gameplay, combat, and like loot mechanics and that sort of thing, I want to jump into the main story itself. I really don't want to spoil anything for those of you who are interested in playing or haven't gotten your hands on the game yet, because I know console still hasn't been able to play. And on top of that, I also haven't finished it myself, but so far it's been really interesting, and I just think that this is something that if you're interested in playing, you really just need to experience for yourself. The story has taken my party to places I did not expect to see, and it's been very steadily ramping to the point where I will say devils and gods are a lot more prominent. Initially, I thought it was just going to be something about fighting goblins, and here we are. So with that being said, while I'm enjoying the main story, I feel like it's in the world and the side stories that the game really shines the most. Everything ties together so perfectly that it's almost impossible to talk about the main story without really bringing up everything else in the world building. I mean, the world building in this game treats you to a full 5-course meal. Everything from the world music to the flavor text of companions is just phenomenal, for lack of a better word. Getting into the different settings without giving too much away, each act has its own overall feel to it, with the first being a traditional forest, swamp, mountain, hills kind of thing, and then the second is a lot more dark and gloomy, but each one also has plenty of smaller areas that make them feel different enough, and the game has some awesome vistas. These environments wouldn't be complete without all of the attention to detail and environmental storytelling that has been implemented in the game. The game doesn't tell you this is what happened here, unless maybe you succeeded on a history roll or something like that, and now you have a small piece of the puzzle. But for the most part, you'll read books on bodies which tell you the story of what happened there, or how they'll take you to entirely new areas in search of treasure or people. In Act 1, for example, you discover an abandoned lair full of books in some nasty cave. And through the diagrams, the gear, and the books that are in the area, you can tell that the person who studied there was some sort of deranged lunatic who turned himself into a spider, and that the spider is somewhere in the cave hoarding some special key to open a book that's in another completely different area. So not only does this type of storytelling tie the different sub-areas together, but it also makes the world feel a lot more alive and immersive. And I feel like by not giving you that full puzzle and just kind of giving you a piece of it, the game really makes you want to play more. It makes you want to experience all of these different things just the way that Elden Ring did. Like, Elden Ring is very cryptic. It doesn't give you the information that you specifically need. It kind of leads you on. It says, okay, maybe you'll find more information if you go to this other zone. And that kind of thing, and not holding your hand, is just incredible for the environmental storytelling. While the setting is important, to me, it's like a guitar track without the bass. In this case, the music in this game does a fantastic job of selling the settings and establishing appropriate tones, whether it's a nice, light tone for exploring, or something a little bit more gloomy and mysterious for exploring ancient temples and crypts. By far, one of my favorite tracks is the one that's playing right now, which is from Act 1, that plays while you fight a group of siren-like harpies on a beach. I don't really know what it is about this one in particular, but there were a few key moments in my playthrough where I went, yeah, this game is incredible. This fight with this song was one of those early moments where I realized just how detailed the world was and how well they all played together to really just bring in that immersiveness that we look for in these kind of games. Finally, in world building, you can't have the world without the people who live in it. The companions in this game are all unique with their own backgrounds and motivations, and everyone has something that they want, so in a way, it feels like you're playing the game not only for yourself, but for them too. This is a major part of how the game grabs you. It really makes you want to see how it all plays out for you and for your party on this epic adventure. Some of the most enjoyable conversations come from speaking with your companions regarding how they feel about the current situation in your playthrough. Every character reacts differently, and you can be sure that at least one of them hates you. Each companion has a storyline that you can follow to gain favor with them, and if you get it high enough, you can progress a romance with them. The ones who don't hate you are probably throwing themselves over each other to have sex with you, and while I appreciate that most of my companions do like me, I just gotta admit, I'm a Shadowheart simp. But all in all, I really do like all of the different companions in my camp, and it's enjoyable to just have them around and talk to them after major story beats. With that being said, the companion characters aren't the only ones that are interesting. You meet some really unique NPCs that lead to some interesting dialogue sections or encounters, and everyone is well voiced, and I personally didn't have any issues with facial animations or anything like that. The world and characters all react to your progress and decisions. One of the most memorable NPCs for me so far is this guy who showed up out of nowhere after I made some progress in the first act. His name is Raphael, and if you've played Witcher 3's DLC Hearts of Stone, then you know exactly why I feel like this. Another example is this big zombie guy that I met in Act 2. He wanted me to tell him something about my adventures over some drinks, and we ended up drinking so much that he exploded and died. Last but not least, I want to talk about the reactivity. I feel like the intricacy of this system is really what makes the world feel alive, as it ties in everything together. The main story, the side stories, the world environments, your characters. It's all based on this level of reactivity in the game. Like, leading up to the game's release, I had heard some talk about how crazy the game was and the decisions and outcomes and how it would have something like 7,000 different endings. And I just brushed all of that aside. Having played the game for about 70 hours now, I'm not sure about the number of endings, and I definitely won't find out for myself, but I can confirm that the choices are meaningful and do have major gameplay impacts. Your race, class, and skill set all factor into your dialogue choices, leading to some truly unique experiences. A couple general examples of this are, like in some specific instances, I was able to convince my enemy in dialogue to literally kill off their own men before I fought them, just to make the fight easier. This level of reactivity is applicable to not only your companions, but also your own character. I think a good example of this is my current versus my previous character. My current character is actually my second character. I rerolled about 20 hours into the first one, but they're both Oath of Vengeance Paladins, which is the subclass in the class. And my first character became an Oathbreaker about 5 minutes into playing the game outside of the initial tutorial zone. Essentially, as an Oath of Vengeance Paladin, it's my job to slay evil, and I somehow managed to mess that up, and it cost me my character's abilities. Granted, they were swapped out for new ones, but it wasn't my intention. Those are just a few examples of how you can approach parts of the game with the choices that you make. Like, as a personal example, I chose mostly the same options on my second character as I did on my first, and I still got different outcomes with some of the NPCs and characters that I talked to. At one point, I even managed to end my game early and roll the credits because I chose the wrong dialogue option. There are just so many different combinations that it really feels like you're never going to experience it all, at least definitely not on a single playthrough. So overall, if you couldn't tell, I'm really enjoying the game and everything that it has to offer. I'm not joking when I say that I would pay $60 for the content in the first act alone. The world is big, but it's not just big, it's dense, it feels alive, and everything from the characters and world building to the combat and general gameplay mechanics feel polished and high quality. So to sum it all up, I'm just going to go over some of my pros and cons in the game. Starting off for pros, we've got the combat and mechanic versatility. It's got that if you can think it, you can do it mentality. Everything about the story so far, the environment and the setting, it's all well paced and well thought out. The music is great, the characters are fun and unique, makes you want to experience more of the game. And by far, I think one of the biggest pros is that the game doesn't hold your hand. Now, I know for some this might be a con, but in this day and age of gaming, I think that this is a huge pro. The character customization is also great. There's a lot of different things that you can do, make your character look how you want it to look. I'm also going to put loot as a pro because it's always fun to finish a fight and then loot the enemy, and then you see that they've got some cool new item with a fun new ability on it. Now, for my cons, these could be subjective, but in my opinion, the game can be time consuming, but again, it's different per person. I also think that the fights can be a little long, especially if you end up wiping your party or if you get into a bad position or whatever it may be. The fights can take a little long. So overall, my con is that the game does feel like a little bit of a time sink sometimes, depending on how much time you take to explore and how many fights you get into and that sort of thing. So your mileage may vary. Now, like I said in the start, I think that this game is a masterclass in role-playing games, and in my opinion, has set a new standard for what RPGs should be. I know there were some devs crying on Twitter about how we shouldn't consider Baldur's Gate 3 as a standard, and that's fine. Good games are hard to make, as we can see based on modern gaming, but I believe that if they tried to implement at least a few of the things that Baldur's Gate 3 does so well, they'd find greater success and push the envelope of what RPGs really can be. I'm not saying that indie studios should be putting out this level of quality, as I feel like that's a little unrealistic, but I think that it is fair to expect AAA game companies to at least try to match something like Baldur's Gate 3, at least to some extent. So that was my review of Baldur's Gate 3. If you're on the fence and you're just kind of looking over and seeing if this is something you might be considering, I personally think that if you're considering it, you definitely should buy it. It's a fantastic game. There's so much content, so much replayability. Sure, it might take a little bit to get through, but it's because there's a lot of depth there. I really do hope that this game ends up being Game of the Year because I genuinely feel like it deserves it. With that being said, please feel free to drop a like down below if you enjoyed the video, and drop a comment letting me know why I'm a filthy Shadowheart simp and should have picked Karlach instead. Thanks for watching, guys.